we've got another new person coming in. All right, so we may have to try this one more time, but everybody who's joining us, like I said, just make sure you keep yourselves on mute, because when you are talking, you do come through our main speaker and it is a little on the loud side. Also, thank you all for coming. Welcome. My name is Carrie O'Donnell. I am the head of adult services here at the library, and we're very happy to have this presentation with the Fair Housing Commission tonight. Thank you all for joining us. We are recording, as I mentioned earlier, and if you have any trouble with your audio or anything like that, type it into the chat, please, and I'll do my best to help you as we go. So third time's the charm, hopefully.
So thank you all for coming. My name is Todd Kaplan. I'm an attorney at Greater Boston Legal Services. I'm a Somerville resident, and I'm also a landlord. And if you have questions, you can either direct them here in person or in the chat. And we'll try and answer whatever questions you have. But I wanted to talk a little bit about how I look at tenant screening, because I have had to screen tenants, but I've also represented people who were discriminated against and wrongly denied tenancies because of tenant screening, and mostly what I would call tenant screening services, which are the biggest, newest thing out there. But we're going to talk about tenant screening services, and we're going to talk about what a lot of people do with tenant screening, which is like by credit score driven or credit driven, and also what are I consider best practices, because I've had to figure out for my own self, not only what does the law say, but what do I personally feel good about in terms of screening tenants. So I only have one apartment, but we've had tenants since we bought the house in 1990, and we've had probably a dozen different tenants. And I'll tell you, we have had our share of tenants that didn't work out, despite the fact that we thought we were doing a good job of screening people. And at times, we also did what I would call a little stretch, where we let somebody rent the apartment that was probably didn't have impeccable tenant recommendations or had some problems in the past, but we decided that we would try anyway. And sometimes that worked out and sometimes it didn't. So let me tell you that there are two ways of looking at this. There's the law, and there's also what I would call the ethical piece of it. How do you feel about yourself, and what are your values? So the law is pretty clear, which is that generally speaking, and there's some exceptions, you can't discriminate against people for what we call protected classes. And in Massachusetts, we have a bunch of protected classes. We have gender, family status, meaning you have children or you're married, that you your sexual orientation, your religion, race, even advocating for others is a protected status, and what?
Source of income.
Source of income, yes, and that's a big one in Massachusetts because that's different from a lot of places. So we have a source of income protection as well. And I forgot to say, of course, disability, which is a huge one.
That's the number one.
It's probably
the number one complaint right now. It's in the top 4 usually.
Yeah, and it's not just the fact of that whether you're a particular race or you have a particular disability or any other protected issues, but even the perception that you are in that group can protect you as well, or put you in the group as well and give you protections. So those are the kind of protections, but it plays out in lots of ways. So for example, when people call and say, I want to rent an apartment, and they say, well, I have a state subsidy, or I have a Section 8, or I get Social Security benefits, or I get food stamps or SNAP, and someone says, well, I prefer somebody who has a job, or I prefer somebody who, you know, I don't have to worry about whether they're gonna be able to pay the rent. So those could be, you're not saying, I don't want something, but you're expressing a preference for something else. Well, that indeed could be a discrimination based upon the source of income, or, as we say, benefits in this, in the, so that could very well be discrimination. But it could pan out all sorts of other ways. For example, somebody says, I like this apartment, but there's no handrail on this particular area, or I need a grab bar in the shower. And there might be a very case that you might have to install something like that. So if you said, no, I don't wanna do anything, you might be incidentally, just not even inadvertently, not thinking that it's a form of discrimination, but that could actually be a form of discrimination as well. And whether you have to install the grab bar or not, it's kind of a iffy question, but probably, generally speaking, if it's not a big deal, just install the grab bar. It's not a big deal. But let me step back and talk about what I do when I am screening, and then I'll get into some of the issues with tenant screening services. So what I do when I'm looking at someone is I want to make sure they can pay the rent. That's not a problem. That's something that's legal. So, but the way they pay the rent could be through income and having a job, or it could be through some sort of subsidy. In Massachusetts, we have a lot of subsidies. We have federal programs like Section 8. We have state programs like what's called MRVP, the Massachusetts Rental Voucher Program. We have some other more transitional type subsidies that are now coming into play that the state is offering. And those are often for a year or 2 years. There's now a city subsidy, so which is brand new, and that is coming out to help people pay the rent. And so you want, you know, what I would be asking is, well, if it was a temporary subsidy, it's a reasonable question to ask what happens when that subsidy ends. That's not unreasonable. And they might say, well, look, if I can't afford the apartment, I'll leave. I have a friend who's gonna let me stay there and I'll just leave. They might say that, or they might say, I'm actually part of an employment training program and it's going to lead me, I'm actually gonna be paid while I'm in the training program. It's gonna lead me to a good paying job. Now that, like everything else in life, nothing is guaranteed, but let's be honest. People who have jobs, pandemic is exhibit A, don't always have guaranteed income. The whole idea that somebody, because they have a job, they're going to be able to pay their rent and everything's gonna work out in the future, that is, if it ever was true, it's not necessarily true today. So everything has an element of risk. And the fact that somebody has a subsidy, to me, especially the federal subsidies or the state subsidies, those are really good because they compensate for somebody's ups and downs in their income, or they have a temporary injury, they have to take some time off. Well, guess what happened during the pandemic? All those people, and we had a tenant with a Section 8 voucher in the pandemic. Everybody else, they couldn't pay their rent. Her rent was always paid because the housing authority immediately compensated for all of the loss of her income. So the rent never changed. We always got the rent. And the whole idea that income is more stable or guaranteed than a subsidy is probably, if it ever was true, it's no longer true. It's been proven not to be true. So I start off, I say, well, how are we gonna pay the rent? And then I do ask, who's gonna live here? I want to meet them. And you know, and you can't really screen the children, but you can screen the family. You can say, well, let me talk to your former landlord. And oftentimes it's better to talk to 2 former landlords. And that would be their current landlord, if they have one, and then a previous tenancy situation. Even if they don't have a landlord, you want to hear about where they live, and somebody should be able to vouch for them. So we accepted a tenant who came out of a shelter system, and they didn't have a current landlord, but I was able to reach and actually talk with a former landlord, and they vouched for them. So there was, and let me just say one thing which is true, and is that sometimes the current landlord wants to end the relationship. Sometimes for good reasons, like I'm selling. So they'll say, this person's great, you should take them, whatever. Sometimes it's because they don't like the person, or they think that the tenancy's not working out. So sometimes they'll give a good landlord reference, even if the person's not a stellar tenant. So I think as a practical matter, if you can, it's always better not to talk to the current landlord, but a prior landlord as well. Because that person has no incentive to mislead you. And just as a fact of the matter is that people will not tell the truth in order to have a tenant move on into another tenancy situation. And as I said, sometimes that's for good reasons. Sometimes they want to raise the rent and the person can't pay it. But sometimes it's because it wasn't working out. So that's why I always go back to a former landlord and want to hear from that person. And then, as I said before, I want to talk to all the people. I want to know all the people. So do you have a boyfriend or a girlfriend or a significant other that's going to be living with you? Or if they're not living with you, where do they live? Because I think that personally, we've had somebody kind of move in through the back door, and it was really not what we bargained for. You were our tenant, and somebody else came move in, and we were, eventually that tenancy didn't work out, but it was one of the factors that undermined the trust. And one of the things that I always think about is how would I want to be treated, but I also want to treat other people well too. So if somebody, I come into the relationship of landlord-tenant as not as friends, but as certainly being honest and saying, here's where we are. For example, we always say, this is a house, not an apartment building. That means that we all have to be respectful of each other, noise, guests. If we don't have smoking in the house, and we don't even want smoking in the front porch. But just if you can live with that kind of situation and kind of quiet hours after 9 or 10 o'clock at night, then that's something that's going to work out. So there's some. It is a situation where if you have somebody living in your house, you really want to have some understanding about what things are. So we start off in that kind of conversation. In fact, recently when we were filling our current tenant moved in within the last 6 months, somebody said, I'm kind of more interested in partying. I don't think this is going to work out. And we're saying, thank you. but it was part of that conversation. It was really part of that conversation. So we're looking at, landlord references. We're looking at your ability to pay your rent, who's going to be living there, and kind of the same kind of screening criteria for all of those. And then, there are a lot of programs, if they can't pay their first or last month's rent or security deposit, there's actually a lot of programs that will fill that in if they're income eligible. So they're really, to me, as I said, kind of just to reiterate, sometimes we have right now somebody with a transitional subsidy that's going to go into its Section 8 after 2 years. And that's already been worked out between the program and the housing authority. So that's going to happen. And that's really a good situation for both us and for them. They're going to be, we're going to have guaranteed income, and it's already been coming in. It's painless. It drops into the bank account every month. You don't have to go around collecting rent. And she's going to have the subsidy so that when, her employment goes up or down or sideways, that will always be covered. I think, so that's the kind of, what I say is kind of, I believe it's the best practices. I feel good about it. I feel it's aligned with my principles of inclusion, meaning that I'm trying to make sure that good housing is available to as many, a broad spectrum of people as possible. And especially here in Somerville, where A lot of people who have a subsidy can't find landlords to accept their subsidy, or they want to stay in Somerville. The woman who staying in her house is in our apartment, actually grew up in Somerville, so it's kind of nice that she was able to come back. So that's kind of the alignment, but then let's talk about what happens in the real world, okay? So what happens in the real world is oftentimes people are approached by a real estate agent, even if you post on Craigslist. People, when I post on Craigslist saying I was looking for tenants, people call me like that and said, wait, don't bother yourself. I'll do all the work. I'll screen the tenants. I'll show the apartment, and you won't have to do anything, and I'll do all the screening. And I won't charge you anything. The tenant will be paid for it. And so that is a very attractive offer for a lot of people. And a lot of people say, oh, well, you're a professional. You know what to look for. You can figure this out. But I think that there is a double-edged sword here, because of course they're helping you out, but there also are some problems here, because oftentimes they're setting criteria that I think are sketchy or likely illegal. And let me tell you what most rental agents are looking for. They're looking for high credit scores. They're looking for no blemishes on their credit, no credit cards in arrears, no collections, nothing. But they aren't necessarily looking for good tenants. They're not necessarily looking at what kind of tenant you are. But first, I recently explained this to somebody. I said, it's kind of like the way college admissions work. People take the SAT, and guess what? The admissions officer says, I can wipe all these people off the table and focus on these people over here because they had just low scores. So it's easy. It makes my job a lot easier just to eliminate all those people and wipe them, sweep them off the table, and I can just, and that, oftentimes that's called creaming, whatever you want to call it. It's basically focusing on people that have stellar, in their terms, stellar credit usually. And so they're not really looking at whether somebody has a good tenancy record. They're looking first to sweep them off the table if they have any credit blemishes. Now, and then they start focusing on these people, and they're looking, then they say, well, you've got steady income, you've got da-da-da-da-da, you don't have credit issues, you're going to be the perfect tenant. Now, those are based upon a lot of assumptions, and we're gonna break that down in a second. But what it doesn't do is find good tenants. What it does do is find people that fit a particular profile. And that is true, and so a lot of rental agents just use this credit score driven or credit report driven screening. And that's how they get to the people that, and obviously for a lot of people, it's whoever can pay them, right? Because they're collecting the fee from the tenant. So immediately that will eliminate a lot of people who have subsidies who can't pay the broker. And guess what? A lot of people who are low income have problems with credit cards. And so now this begs the question of whether credit score or credit card debt or even collections of credit cards has anything to do with whether you are going to be a good tenant. And I would suggest that that connection is completely absent. There are no studies, and I've looked at this very carefully and been part of litigation where we've pushed this. There are no studies that show that credit scores are indicative of whether somebody's going to be a good tenant. Furthermore, people's on-time rental payments never appear. Essentially, statistically never appear on credit reports. So the things that you'd want to be indicators of whether somebody's going to be a good tenant are completely absent from this screening process. And then finally, and this is more intuitive, but we know this because of working with people that are low income. Guess what they prioritize? They prioritize paying their rent. People will give up food, heat, medicine, to keep a roof over their heads and the roof over their children's heads. So what we've built in our society is a system that is sweeping all sorts of people off the table for, I would suggest, are probably illegitimate and perhaps illegal reasons. And I'm going to go into the illegal in a second. So that's pure credit score driven screening. But even on top of that, even worse, is what I would call algorithmic or real tenant screening reports. So there's some big companies, Safe Rent, Rent Grow, and some, the third one I can't remember off the top of my head, but they create what I would call a comprehensive report and come up with a thumbs up or thumbs down recommendations. So these market themselves as providing a complete holistic approach to tenant screening, because they're looking at eviction records, they're looking at credit reports, and they're looking at, guess what? Who knows what? It's secret. So part of their
credit scores.
secret formula is not just credit scores.
But credit scores are also secret.
Yeah, yes, how you create credit scores are a secret. Although it's kind of, you can see the underlying information. But what happens with these tenant screening companies is oftentimes they're using other information which they don't disclose to you. For example, they could use the zip code of where you live. Where you currently live, that zip code, that is not illegal for them to, that's not a per se, meaning, no law on the book says you cannot use the zip code where you currently live to influence or be a big factor in how you're screened. So it's what you can call it a black box, you can call it a secret formula, whatever you want to call it. These companies have a complete, basically opaque process. They will give you the underlying information, but they won't tell you how they weighted and how they put it together. And along that report, and I've seen them, it'll have your address where you're currently living. So they're disclosed, but you don't even know if that's a factor or a zero factor. Now, the problem with this black box or algorithmic screening is that you don't know how to respond. When somebody gives you a report saying, here's the underlying information. In fact, the denials, really the whole nice thing from the landlord's or management company's perspective is that they even generate the denial letter. And the denial letter will say, you've been denied, here's where you can get your report. If you find anything in the report that's wrong, you go tell them, don't ask us anything. We will not tell you any reason why you've been denied, except for the fact that a report was generated, and you can go ask them about but they won't tell you why they rejected you. They will tell you that you were rejected. Sometimes they'll say, this was a factor or that was a factor, but they won't tell you if it was a deciding factor or not. So, but for my clients who've been rejected, oftentimes it's you had some credit cards that were in arrears or charged off. And as I said, when you look at the report, it has nothing about their prior tenancies. That is completely off these reports. Why? Because they're not reported. No, there's no systemic reporting. When you pay your rent on time, as people often do, there's no systemic reporting of that to these agencies. So these reports, which are marketing themselves as true tenant screening services, are nothing more than fancy credit driven with some other secret sauce thrown in. Now, let's go back to why this is problematic. So we, meaning Greater Boston Legal Services, the National Consumer Law Center, and another private firm called Cohen Milstein, sued Safe Rent. And we allege that they created this secret sauce and that it hurt our clients, and actually Community Action Agency Somerville was a plaintiff in this action. And that it was discriminatory what they did, because our clients, who were the named plaintiffs in this lawsuit, had perfect tenancies. And both of them had some small credit card issues. And when they appealed, they said, no, we're really good tenants. We'll give you our landlord references. One company said, we don't even care. The other company actually let us overcome the denial. So that person, the other tenant, moved into this wonderful 55+ community. That's actually where the Revere Copper Works plant was in Canton. And it's a beautiful, with a pool and a restaurant, and it has inclusionary zoning units, and she really wanted to be in a 55+ community, and we overcame that denial. But we still sued Safe Rent around that, because it was really the formula that they relied on to deny. And most people, and nowhere in that letter, let me just be clear, nowhere in the denial letter did it say you may appeal. We appealed anyway, because we wanted to push them to the edge and see what would happen. So if that means that lots and lots of people never appealed because they didn't know to push it. But in any case, the allegation was that in this case is now settled, so I can talk about it. The allegation is that because both of these people were a Community Action Agency of Somerville, it works with people that have both subsidies. Both people have Section 8s, but were in persons of color who have a much, much higher rate of having credit card issues. That the mechanism, the formula, the Safe Rent secret sauce was disproportionately excluding persons of color who had these credit issues, despite the fact that they had Section 8s, they essentially had guaranteed rent. It was always going to be affordable, and despite the fact that they were perfect tenants. Both of these people had impeccable, perfect tenancy records. And in fact, any real landlord would say, oh, this is the kind of person I want, because they will be great. They've been great, and they will be great. One of them was a security guard, and the other one, it was a home health aide. And both have always been employed and still employed. So that case, I should say, how did it settle? It settled with Safe Rent saying that they're no longer going to use their secret sauce for people who have vouchers. It's chipping away at the screening service, but it's important because it's nationwide. That will no longer be the case. So that's a real victory, but we're also, of course, looking at other companies too now, because we see the same kind of actions, the same kind of problems with other companies. Now, let's think about how this applies to you, because I think what we really want to think about is both landlords and tenants. How should tenant screening work? So how can you take control over tenant screening? And I think that one of the first things is, go ahead.
Okay, just thank you for the open door. As concerned neighbors interested in the block, and also to get that nudge of moral support for the owner occupied or the absentee landowner to do the right thing in this case. I'm interested in adding that wrinkle in, but maybe it's after you've addressed this layer.
No, that's a very good question. So I'm going to repeat it, but I'm going to try and come back, which is that how can we, not just landlords, but as community members, how can we try to foster an environment where people do the right thing, and use the best practices of tenant screening, as opposed to just running out and letting a rental agent or somebody else control the process. So I'm going to try and keep that in mind. So the thing that you can do to control the process, if you're a landlord, is when a rental agent says, I'm going to use tenant credit score based screening, say, no, thank you. And, or it can say, or you don't even have to use the rental agent. But if you want to use a rental agent, say, here's what the criteria I want. I want to know who their current landlord is, I wanna know who the former landlord is, and I want to know what they say about the tenant. Were there problems with neighbors? Did they pay their rent on time? And why did they leave? Those are all legitimate questions and those things that you wanna know. And if they can't, you know, and you could say, you know, well, if you can't look at two, maybe one, you can be flexible, but you can say, do your work. Don't just, you know, flip a switch and get a credit report and say thumbs up, thumbs down, but do your work if you're gonna earn the money, and actually, try to do some real screening. And the other thing is you wanna meet the people and you wanna have, you know, it's really, the real problem is called, what I would call, cultural nepotism. That's that
Yeah.
we tend to decide, when we look at people, we interview people, and we so on, even at work or in tenancies, we tend to like people that are like us. So that's what I call cultural nepotism. And, so I think that trying to, there is a piece of having someone like a rental agent, whatever, say, no, I don't wanna put my own bias on this. I want to have some neutral criteria so that you're bringing in people and say, well, all these people have good references, whatever, and you know, and so on. But I think that we have to be cognizant of this whole cultural nepotism that we tend to you know, in hiring and everything. Oh, you know, this, I can imagine getting along with this person. Well, that's a certain kind of cultural nepotism of like, well, you know, they have the same interests as me, whatever. So that's the thing. Now, in terms of the, you know, the community, I think that that's a great question about how do we as a community foster this? You know, there are some communities, and the ones that I remember are, Hyde Park, Illinois, that actually has a program where they really try to encourage, foster an environment in the community where people are actively thinking about these issues and working on these, trying to make it a level playing field and trying to, you know, create opportunity for all. We in Somerville, if you think about the kind of subsidies programs that we're offering here in Somerville, that is a way to, because we're offering them to people who do not have access to other subsidy programs. And we're trying to stabilize people in their homes and in place. That to a certain degree is also fostering this culture of inclusion and trying to make sure that we, you know, stabilize people that are in our community and create opportunity. And I think when I say opportunity, it's really, there's a lot of very good data on and studies on what happens to children and families in high opportunity areas. So Somerville is a high opportunity area. The kids that go to school here, the kids that live here tend to, even if they're not in a home where there's a lot of education, or they're in a home where both parents are struggling, they tend to, basically it's like riding a wave. They tend to, not all, but a lot of kids are able to really basically climb out of wherever, you know, they would be destined to be stuck if they were in a high poverty community. They are able to, you know, my older daughter went to school here at Somerville High with several kids that were the first in their families to ever go to college. And that was something that if they're in a high poverty area, they're not gonna be around all those kids that are like on this trajectory. And it's really kind of like riding a wave where people are who are really motivated. Kids are, you know, they are obviously really smart, but they don't have a lot of opportunity. They're able to kind of get swept up into this culture of success. And so that's a huge, you know, so Somerville is really a high opportunity area, and we really, and as many areas around here are, it's a way of fostering that. So I wanted to make sure there's any questions out there or anything that I haven't covered.
So if anybody has any questions, if you wanna put them in the chat, now is a good time to do that, based on our conversation. If anybody here has a question, I think we can, take some of those as well.
And I also wanted to say, go ahead.
Oh, I was gonna say, if you want, you can write them down, or
Just
you
talk.
can
you
just
can just
ask,
ask,
since
yeah.
we're a small
Yeah, we're a
group in
small
person, so feel free.
Go ahead.
Being a senior, I've lived in income-based housing in another state, and some of my fellow residents were there for a number of years, and their health deteriorated to the point where they really shouldn't have been living alone.
Hmm.
But the families, for whatever reason, if there were families, did not step in. And at the time I left, the landlord was trying to figure out what to do with them. In Massachusetts, what would you suggest if this happened to one of your tenants?
Oh, that's a great question. Well, I think, let me flip it around and just say, to start out, is that there are, if I recall correctly, the VNA facility that's down by Alewife has basically a continuum of care, where they have basically different levels of care based upon what you need. And that kind of environment, of course, is really, really great, because people who can live completely independently can live independently, and as they need more care, they can either move to another wing of the same facility, or they can get more in-place services. I think in Massachusetts, but let's flip it around to the in-place services. I mean, Massachusetts is really, you know, I have to say, compared with lots of states, we have a lot of resources. So there are, you know, of course, there are regional elder health systems. There are, we're gonna talk about, you know, people who are elders at this point. And there's also, within each municipality, usually, there's an elder service center. I know I've worked with people in Arlington, I've worked with people in Somerville, I've worked with people in Quincy, all sorts of, on a municipal basis, but also with a regional, like, for example, Minuteman covers Somerville, and then there's another one that's South Shore Elder Services. Each area has, and they're able to put, you know, basically home health services in place, and cleaning services, chore services. I mean, you can get a lot of services depending on your needs to stay in place. And then, you know, the biggest, I should say, the biggest gaps though in services are people who are not elders, who have mental health needs or housekeeping needs or whatever. Those type of services are not as easy to access, because they're basically on a, they're budget driven. So there's no right to those services. You can basically get in line. Or if you need mental health services to stabilize yourself in the community, you might get screened in because of a crisis that's going on. But if you only need kind of low level services, you might just get screened out because you're not in crisis yet. Or even if you're in crisis, you get in line. So it's a very, it's a tough system, but I would say though that you know, even in Somerville, we have, you know, compared with the past, we have a lot of resources. We have Office of Housing Stability, where landlords and tenants can both reach out and kind of figure out how to work on things. And so and that, you have to think about that office did not exist a short time ago. And now it has huge staff and a lot of programs, and it's really an integral part of what we offer here in Somerville. And Cambridge has had, and sorry to say, Cambridge is rich. Cambridge has had a multi-service center for as far as I can remember, 30 years, where they, you know, had lots and lots and lots of services in Cambridge, and staff. And our human services staff were all disassembled and completely eliminated from city services after Proposition 2.5 came into place and we had huge budget cuts. So it's a remarkable renaissance and return to the kind of level of services that we had a long time ago, that we now have. So it's you know, when I think about the level of services we have in Somerville, it's quite remarkable.
Thank you.
So far, I haven't seen any questions come through the chat, but if anybody has one, please feel free to drop it in there. Does anybody?
And I do want to say, if anyone throws their email in the chat or gives it to me in person, this is I can email them a copy of this, which is kind of a legal document, but it kind of describes all the current landscape in terms of all of the discrimination laws in Massachusetts, cover Massachusetts, and you know, who's covered, who's not covered, lots of examples in here. And I like this particular this one. It is written for lawyers, but it's easy enough to understand. So if anyone wants a copy of this, I can email that to them as well. Sorry to.
No, that's great. And honestly, if you can send that to me as well, I can send it out to everybody
Oh,
who
that's.
registered for tonight's program.
That
So
would be
you'll
great.
be able
That'd be
to
great.
get
So you'll automatically get one of these, and it's very well done.
I have two questions, speaking as a two-family house landlord.
Yeah.
One is it a legitimate question to say, show me the receipts for your last 12 months of rent? Or is that too invasive?
No, I mean, I think it would be, I think it's not a problem as if for anybody, even, you know, to ask that, because I don't think that's necessarily discriminatory. I think the problem is that sometimes people won't have them because they paid in cash, or the landlord sometimes even refused to give receipts. So it is a question of like, well, what is there something in lieu of that they could provide to show if they pay in cash or whatever. If they had a subsidy, it's very easy to get those records, at least from the housing authority side. But whether the tenant, sometimes I've had clients whose tenant share was so low, the landlord didn't even bother collecting. It was like $35 a month or whatever. Yeah, that's the beauty of the subsidies though, because they're really kind of guaranteed.
Just a side sort of comment about that, which is that before the Dodd-Frank changes to mortgages, they used to routinely the mortgage lenders would routinely look for 12 months rent.
Wow.
And I had a client who was rejected because his rent was always like the 26th of the 27th of the month. And they were like, well, he's routinely late. And he had to get a letter from the landlord saying, no, he was routinely early.
Oh, that's crazy. That is
So,
amazing.
I mean, so, you know, it was just like one of the ridiculous things that happened.
Yeah, no, there are tenants like that who like do not want to have any issues, who will pay early. That is kind of funny, how crazy. So, yeah, I mean, because you know, but it does kind of point out something that we know from the real world, which is that underwriting, to a certain extent, which is what you do when you're trying to figure out whether you're gonna finance somebody for a house or a car or something like that, any kind of loan, is to a certain extent fiction or a construct, because it's saying that this particular pattern in the past is indicative of how you're gonna be in the future. But we all know that people lose their jobs, they get sick, there's lots of things so it is a predictor to a certain extent, but it's only a model that it has its flaws, and it doesn't necessarily predict everything. The same for, you know, these tenant screening services are kind of trying to create the appearance that they are like loan underwriting. And that's, and I just want to circle back to the fact that there is no science. I've worked with people from MIT, from Harvard, people that have been litigating this area for years. There is zero science, meaning no studies that show that you're paying on credit cards or paying a car loan has anything to, or not paying on those things, has anything to do with your paying your rent. So I think this, at some point, these tenant screening companies will have to reckon with the fact that there's people like me out there that will sue them over this and trying to get this a little bit more under control. In the meantime, I should say, because this is a renter's market here in Massachusetts, that they can really get perfect tenants. And so they're over here in the corner picking between, Bill and Joe and Sue and whatever other people are out there. And all these people out here who are also really good tenants are just getting left on the table. So they're just, and I should say a little bit about artificial intelligence and the way that this is going to play out, or is currently playing out. There's no doubt in my mind that when a company buys a system like RentGrow or these other ones out there, that they're getting, the rent records are being flowed back to them. So that when they screen in Bill and Susie, they're watching Bill and Susie, how they go in through their system, and they're gonna find out how long their tenancies are and what happens to them. And so they're going to, and then if Bill and Susie fall on the wayside, we're gonna find out what happens with the other people, so that it will be a system that is automatically learning which are the better tenants and getting better and better and better and better. That simultaneously will be more and more and more discriminatory against people that have these credit issues. So it is a system that is going to, as part of kind of, increasing the, becoming more efficient and maximizing the return to the management company and the owner of the development, wherever they are, is going to get more fine-tuned in a way that actually is more discriminatory. And denying, and not, and denying opportunity. Denying the opportunity for people to live in places like Somerville, and I have to say, one of the buildings in Union Square denied my client, who was a perfect tenant. Perfect. Because her then husband had taken one of her credit cards, used it without authority, and she'd gone to them and said, and tried to dispute all the charges. And they wouldn't take off the charges, and she said, okay, well, let's settle. And she paid less than the balance. They reported that as settled for less than the balance, and that was the only reason that one of these wonderful, beautiful inclusionary zoning buildings denied her. And only after incredible pressure from us and the Office of Housing Stability did we overcome that. But it's happening right today in Somerville.
Is it one of the great,
Brand new, beautiful building.
hundreds of units, right?
Brand new, beautiful, fancy building that if you look down the hill, you'll see them.
Go to Union Square and look up, yes.
So this is definitely happening in Somerville today. And this person has kids in the schools. Go ahead.
Well, my block on Trill Street seems to be representative of that we have probably 60% are renters. Across the city, I see numbers like that. And I've been learning and when I've talked to I've done about 30 interviews now with folks that just live on my block. And what's a good question that I can ask renters and owners to know a little bit more towards the story, to build the case into kind of eventually down the road, do some advocacy, block to block, neighbor to neighbor around stigmatizing how we can stigmatize rent growth on the one hand, and also nudge in a positive way towards the city services like I hear you doing. What's a good question that I can, in these interviews, kind of add to? It's also about investigating to know how I can get a hold of the owner, and then through the management company is the end, but.
That is a very good question. To start with the end, it's very hard because about reaching who's the actual decision maker, because oftentimes they have agents or real estate companies or management companies that are running the property. But sometimes those management companies are the decision makers. Sometimes it's all delegated to them with a financial arrangement that the better they do with collecting rents and managing the property, the more that they make. So I hate to say that it's, you know, the one thing that it, how can I say this nicely? I think that people pay attention when they're sued. I have to say that. I'm a lawyer. I think when people pay attention when they're sued. So one of the things that we're, you know, trying to do is make it, you know, pushing back, and so we've sued management companies, and we will sue tenant screening companies. And when people see that there's a risk, like economic risk to using these services, then that very well may change behavior. And that's a stick approach. That's like, you know, punish you and make it difficult for you to do your business as usual. The carrot approach is really harder, and it really is. It's because, you know, we really live in a world where people care about money, and that's just kind of a reality here. You know, somebody recently said to me, the community action agency of Somerville is working with buildings where the landlord, you know, the person who just bought it, he says, well, here's my mortgage. And my mortgage doesn't work with these rents. And I have to get rid of all these people. You know, they're trying to convince that landlord just to sell to a nonprofit. Just get out of it. This is completely unsustainable. And you built a model here that is crazy, but you know, you bought into it. But here's an exit strategy. So we're going to try and convince you to just sell, and consider selling out. But for a lot of those people, it's really, you know, a completely devoid of any kind of, you know, human or moral analysis. It's about making money, and that's really just kind of really a shame about how we've monetized something that's kind of basic human need, which is housing. So that's not a good answer. You know, it doesn't really talk about, you know, how to influence people. Although I would say that working with the Community Action Agency of Somerville and trying to, you know, stand solidarity with tenants who are pushing back against their landlords and trying to get landlords to sell the buildings to nonprofits is probably a good way to build solidarity within the community. It doesn't really answer the question of how to get them to do better tenant screening, but does help to stabilize our community.
Well, it's a lot easier to talk to someone who owns 2 units and lives in one of them, or owns 2 units and lives in a house in Waltham, than somebody who owns 750 units across town.
Right. Yeah, and there is something to be said about people that are going to stay, because turnover actually has a cost. Turnover means that you have a vacancy oftentimes a month or 2, plus people usually have to paint and do repairs to make it look good. I certainly do that, anytime someone moves out, I kind of go through and make sure everything's, really good shape. There is a benefit to somebody who's gonna stay in the property for a long time. Anecdotally, and this is something that should be studied, is Community Builders, runs affordable housing across the country. And in polling their property managers, people with subsidies actually stay longer. And so when you have less turnover, that means that it's more profitable. So, that's something to think about when, the best tenant, the person who can pay the most might not be the best tenant, or at least the most economically beneficial.
Todd, you mentioned the Office of Housing Stability a
Yeah.
few times, and that's a fairly recent but highly encouraging development in Somerville. I wonder if you could mention some of the things that the office does that help to produce housing stability. I'm specifically thinking of, in relation to landlords. I think there's a program that encourages landlords who are willing to keep their rents at a low to moderate level, and there's some other measures that they take. Can you talk about
Well, I
that?
think one of the things that, first of all, they do offer mediation services. So that's often huge, that's a huge thing if people are, I've actually referred friends and, who've had like tenants that were essentially hiding because they didn't know what to do during crisis, and they couldn't pay the rent. And that, the office, if you call the Office of Housing Stability as the landlord, they'll reach out to your tenant and see if they, talk about the kind of benefits and the kind of actually, they have some money that can help stabilize people, as well as services. They will help, and they will really work with people to, figure out, well, what do you need to stay in this place? They, as we mentioned earlier, they have this subsidy program, so that's that's just rolled out now. That is working towards, looking at people that don't fit, are basically falling through the cracks and not eligible for other services. And then, they actually have another program, basically incentivizing, stabilizing families in Somerville and accepting subsidies. So they'll pay for, even some repairs. Sometimes you may have to do a little bit of repairs or something to fix your unit. So it will be past the Section 8 inspection, but Somerville Office of Housing Stability has a program to actually pay that. If it's a Somerville resident, it's able to provide other services, incentives to keep people in Somerville. So they really have a lot of creative things that they've done and figured out how, and as well as I kind of say is case management. If somebody is being, losing their housing, trying to keep them in Somerville or at least housed. So there's just a huge range of services, and that has, thanks to the mayor and city council, has really been quite, it may prioritize in terms of funding from one person to, I think they probably have 10 people now, start off with one person. So.
Questions?
I'm not seeing any questions in the chat. If anybody has anything that's come up or that they've thought of last minute, now is your chance to ask it. Just type it right in. And I know we're just about at 8, so I do just want to say thank you to everybody for coming. Thank you so much for your presentation. And if anybody has any questions that maybe comes up afterwards, please feel free to send them my way and I will pass them along and hopefully we can get some answers for you. I also want to mention that the Fair Housing Commission and the library will be having another program on the 27th. We are going to do a film screening and book discussion. So the film is Segregated by Design, And the book that we will be discussing is The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein. That will be here in this same place. It will unfortunately not be virtual, just so that we can show the film, but please feel free to come to the library. You can register for that online on our library's website, or you can give the library a call and one of our library staff will help you register. And you don't have to have read the entire book or even any of the book in order to come and have the discussion, because all of the main topics of that book will be in the film that we'll be showing. So I hope people are able to attend. You can check the book out online if you'd like. And if anybody has any other questions for me, again, like I said, feel free to send them even after the meeting is over. And I just want to say a big thank you to the Somerville Fair Housing Commission for doing this with me and with us.
So how many people are on Zoom?
Right now, we've got, I think, about 6 people on Zoom, and we've got 6 or 7 people here, so
Okay.
thank you, everybody, for coming out tonight. Any last words of wisdom or thoughts, or?
No, thanks, Todd.
Thank you.
Thank you so very good, thank you.
All right, and this will be online as soon as I'm able to get it up there within the next day or 2. All right, I'm gonna stop the recording now, it might be a little loud.
You're doing some really interesting